When it came to building up their air forces in the mid-1930s, the British had a pretty considerable list to work through. I mean, pretty much every single type they operated in 1935 was obviously outdated and going to be even more so in the next year or two. And while much ink gets spilt on things like fighters and bombers, which to be fair were more pressing and served in huge numbers, one mission that obviously needed a new aircraft as quickly as possible was that of land-based torpedo bomber. In fact, the RAF had only acquired a new aircraft to fulfill this role in late 1932, but that aeroplane, the Vickers Wildebeest, well, look at it. To be fair to the Wildebeest, which I have covered in a previous video, it saw combat with its heroic crews in some truly desperate actions during the Second World War. But even in 1935, it was obvious that it was an aircraft way behind the times, and the Royal Air Force were desperate to get a more modern one to replace it in service. A specification for a new torpedo attacker / general naval reconnaissance aircraft was issued, and both Bristol's and Blackburn created proposals to meet it. So desperate were the RAF by this point that both aircraft were ordered straight off the drawing board, a decision that would ultimately come back to bite them, but as said, they were desperate, and a lack of time before an outbreak of conflict made the acquisition a pressing priority. Blackburn's aircraft was the Boater, which is a subject for another day, but if you know, you know. Bristol's was the Beaufort. In many ways, it was an evolution of the Bristol Blenheim Light Bomber, which the company were churning out as fast as they could to meet orders. Compared to its predecessor, the Beaufort was larger and heavier, mainly due to the increased size of the bomb bay and the requirement to increase crew to 4 over the Blenheim's 3. To compensate for this, more use was made of aluminium alloys in the airframe, replacing steel components used in the Blenheim. But primarily, the solution was seen as utilising more powerful engines. Initially, Bristol's hoped to use the Perseus, a sleeve valve radial design broadly comparable to the Mercury used in the earlier aircraft, but this failed to deliver enough power at the time of the Beaufort's development, and so the decision was made to instead fit the aircraft with Bristol's brand new engine under development, the Taurus. This was a twin-row design, broadly equivalent to the American Twin Wasp series, but whereas that engine was well along in its development cycle and already in widespread service, the Taurus, a very advanced sleeve valve design, first ran in 1936. It would also prove to be a bit of a nightmare both in development and in service. This soon became apparent in testing of the new Beaufort, with the Taurus having major problems from overheating in ground testing. This delayed the first flight until October 1938, and the Taurus would continue to be an issue for much of the aircraft's active life. On top of this, the Beaufort had the various sorts of aerodynamic issues that you would expect from a cutting-edge design. It may seem odd describing the Beaufort as such, but that's what it was. Again, I refer you back to the aircraft it replaced, the Wildebeest. Because while testing revealed multiple issues that required tweaking of the airframe, the Beaufort demonstrated a top speed of 271 miles per hour, almost double that of the Wildebeest. The Beaufort was also extremely tough, and the crew was able to move around the aircraft fairly easily, an often overlooked factor which is important for those long over-ocean patrols. Armament was initially rather light, with a single forward-firing machine gun in the port wing and twin guns in the power-operated dorsal turret, but soon would ramp up to include additional guns in the nose and in beam positions, as well as a remote-operated gun under the nose firing rearwards. Payload was composed of up to 1,500 pounds of bombs in the bomb bay and under the wings, or else a single 2,000-pound bomb on a special under-fuselage carrier, or a single 18-inch aerial torpedo. However, when the Beaufort began to enter service with Coastal Command in early 1940, it was soon realised that there was a problem with its primary mission. The British aerial torpedo in service had been designed for use by aircraft like the Fairey Swordfish and the Wildebeest, aircraft that were far more sedate in their flight performance. These aircraft would, certainly in the pre-war era, practice a particular attack method that saw them dive towards their target, flatten out, and then release their torpedo. But in the much faster Beaufort, this method meant the torpedo often broke up when it hit the water, or else skip across the surface like a skimming stone, hardly conducive for accurate attacks. This meant that the only way for the Beauforts to initially attack was to come in at low level and steady speeds, which much increased the risk of getting shot down and kind of negated the point of the faster aircraft. Attempts to remedy this involved fitting dive brakes, which badly impacted aircraft handling and ultimately were abandoned, and else developing a new form of gliding torpedo called the Plane. This, despite undergoing development right up until 1942, never really worked, and so when the Beaufort entered operational service with No. 22 Squadron in April 1940, the only way to conduct torpedo attacks was with a low and slow approach. Having said that, another major issue was that the Beaufort squadrons didn't have torpedoes available to them initially due to shortages. As a result, their first missions were mine dropping around the North Sea, while anti-shipping missions were flown initially with bombs. The type's first attack on a capital ship occurred just months after they entered service, when 9 Beauforts attacked the battleship Scharnhorst off the Norwegian coast on the 21st of June 1940. Despite a valiant effort, with the Beauforts making dive bomb attacks with 500-pound bombs, no substantial damage was inflicted on the ship, while 3 Beauforts were shot down by escorting Bf 109 fighters, though they did claim one of these in return. And while that may seem bad, consider that a week before the Royal Navy had attacked the Scharnhorst with 15 Skua dive bombers and lost 8 of them, showing that while the Beaufort was not perfect, it was far from a sitting duck. Indeed, there were bigger concerns about the new torpedo bomber, and just after this action, the whole fleet of Beauforts was grounded due to concerns caused by the mysterious disappearance of a number of aircraft that had vanished on mining missions. The suspicion, almost certainly correct, was in the Taurus engines, and urgent modifications were made in order to get the new torpedo bombers back into service as quickly as possible. In September 1940, the Beaufort made its first torpedo attack on enemy shipping, when aircraft from 22 Squadron managed to hit a large merchantman off the coast of Belgium. In fact, the Beaufort's efforts in the early war years now seems to often be overlooked, especially when compared to torpedo missions conducted by its far more famous naval equivalent, the Fairey Swordfish. Just about everyone has heard of the torpedo missions flown by that aircraft against the Bismarck and in the heroic but futile attacks on the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau during the Channel Dash of February 1942. But hardly anyone remembers the similar efforts by Beaufort crews. Take, for example, the attack on the Gneisenau in April 1941 when she was anchored in Brest harbour in France. Despite being protected by literally hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and swarms of fighters, a single Beaufort was able to penetrate the defences and, through extremely precise dropping to avoid the screening torpedo nets, slammed a torpedo into the side of the battleship, inflicting significant damage that saw the Gneisenau out of action for 6 months and winning the pilot, Kenneth Campbell, a posthumous VC when his aircraft went down in flames in the face of intense defensive fire. Another forgotten example is that of the attack on the pocket battleship Lutzow as she steamed off the coast of Norway early in the morning of 13 June 1942. After a long nighttime hunt, once again, a single Beaufort managed to get through the warship's defensive escort and hit her with a torpedo, putting the Lutzow, like her bigger cousin, in a dry dock for 6 months for repairs. These are just a couple of examples of the more significant actions flown by Beauforts and their crews that have now largely passed from widespread recollection. Yet they are just the tip of the iceberg, because these aircraft were flying continuous actions harassing German and Italian shipping in the North Sea and then the Mediterranean when the campaigns there started. While other types often get credit for the mauling that Axis shipping got that helped gradually choke off the supplies going to Rommel in North Africa, Beauforts were very much in the thick of the action, sinking ships and bombing land targets as well, and all in all played an important, though as said largely unheralded, part in the Allied air campaign in the theatre throughout 1941 and 42. But arguably their biggest impact was felt in the Pacific, and not just in a purely military sense. In 1938, the Australians, smartly realising that in the event of a major conflict they probably wouldn't be able to acquire aircraft from their traditional suppliers, decided that they'd better be able to make their own, and set about choosing what they thought best suited their needs. They decided on the Beaufort. The Australian aircraft industry was in its earliest infancy at the time. They had just begun building Wirraway light trainers as their most advanced design. So the Beaufort, an advanced twin-engine design, represented the perfect compromise between both pushing and increasing the capabilities and experience of Australian home production, while providing an aircraft capable of defending the country's gigantic coastline. And the Aussies made another very smart move. They changed the engine. Initially, the plan was to use British supplied Tauruses, but when the war started in Europe in September 1939, that soon went out of the window, with Britain needing every bit of their production for their own use. With the advanced British Taurus, a sleeve valve design, being a complicated build for even the experienced British builders, the Australians decided to fit their homemade Beauforts with license-built Pratt & Whitney twin Wasps. These were slightly more powerful than the Tauruses, as well as vastly more reliable, and with the twin Wasp, the Australian Beauforts, as with their European counterparts, fought the critical but less remembered actions against the Japanese across the Southwest Pacific during the tooth and nail fighting throughout 1942 and 43. Indeed, the RAAF thought highly enough of the Beaufort that they kept it in production and service longer than the British, using it to the end of the war, while the British began to phase out the type in 1943, with some 1,121 being made in Britain and another 700 in Australia. Because while the Beaufort was cutting edge in the late 1930s, tactical and technical developments meant that it was soon appreciated that different aircraft were required, and here the Beaufort made a final contribution. Starting from the Beaufort and utilising certain components such as most of the wing and some other elements, Bristol's had begun developing a long-range fighter offshoot in 1938 for what was thought to be a stopgap aircraft. This ended up becoming the Beaufighter, a formidable machine that very much eclipsed its predecessor and established a formidable reputation as a fighter bomber and, ultimately, as a torpedo attacker as well, which largely replaced its progenitor. And while it is easy to dismiss the Beaufort as simply a stepping stone to its far more famous offspring, that isn't entirely fair. The Beaufort is another example of an early aircraft that bore the brunt of the brutal early years of fighting. Like its progenitor, the Blenheim, and its naval equivalent, the Albacore, which was also cursed with the troublesome Taurus engine, the Beaufort flew countless missions and fought vast numbers of actions in the crucial days when the outcome of the conflict was very much in the balance. Like the other types I mentioned, the Beaufort has very much a checkered reputation, basically due to its heavy loss rates, which is pretty much attributable to its lackluster power plant, but more especially to failures in tactical methods that left the aircraft horribly exposed in the face of opposition. In fact, I would say that when you dig in any depth into the accounts of those who flew the Beaufort, you quickly realise that while the aircraft was far from satisfactory, it was probably amongst the best of its type in its time frame. As I have said before on other aircraft of the early war period, hard lessons in modern aerial warfare needed to be learnt, and learning during war is an expensive business in machines and men. But the Beaufort, imperfect as it was, allowed that experience to be acquired and built upon, while also being capable of doing the job that was required of it and inflicting significant losses on Axis forces in practically every theatre of the Second World War. And because those efforts often did not come from some grand decisive battle, but instead from the slow, bloody grind that was the real essence of the war, well, now what is primarily remembered about the Beaufort is the bad reputation. Not the fact that it carried the burden until later, and generally far more famous aircraft, were able to be created from the experience that the Beaufort and its crews, as well as its contemporaries, provided from holding the line for much of the war.